Well, let's talk about some of the other players who had to step up to the plate because she was there. Your buddy Steve Porcaro. I mean,
Yeah.
of everybody, he seemed to really be channeling Keith. I mean, not just the playing technique, but
Yeah.
also his body movements. I mean, he was so
You've
into
never
it.
seen him move so much ever.
He
That
was-
he did there. Well, you got to remember that when the first time he saw Keith was in at the Hollywood Bowl.
Yeah.
And they were opening for Edgar Winter's White Trash, or Edgar Winter was opening for them. I can't. No, I think Edgar was opening for Emerson and Palmer. Anyway, and he hadn't seen Emerson and Palmer, didn't know anything about him. And they came out and started with Barbarian. And basically, Steve's life changed right at that spot. He kind of recounts a little of that in the interviews on the DVD. And so again, I went to every keyboard player and said, "What do you want to play? What tunes are special to you? And we'll do those with you." And Steve, without a minute, just said, "Barbarian, dude." Like, oh, okay. And so him playing it, it was just like him paying back Keith for all of those years of inspiration. And I've never seen him like move that much ever in anything. He's back there grooving all the time. But even when he was playing with Keith in the Boys Club, he was pretty immobile when you compare it to what he just did on, the organ parts, the Hammond parts on Barbarian. It's channeling Keith. It was very cathartic for him.
Well, let's see, as I said, there's 11. We've only mentioned 3. So we've got Ed Roth, no surprise there. And that was him playing organ on Hoedown. Yeah. And much more what you would expect, like the chilled out guy making the fingers wiggle, but not necessarily doing, the cartwheels like Steve.
Yeah.
Was.
And again, Hoedown was the one that made, he heard that and just went, "This is unbelievable." Yeah. So that, all of these tunes that the keyboardist chose had meaning for them specially. It was either the first thing that they heard or the one that they really gravitated to, or the one thing that they took the time to learn. Any of those things, it was special. That's why you get these performances out of them, because they were just so, never thought they'd be able to ever play this stuff live with anybody.
Right.
And except when they were in their bedroom doing it the first time, when they were living at their folks' house,
And it's interesting how the cycle continues, because for Keith himself, Aaron Copland was the composer of Hoedown and of Fanfare for the Common Man. So, he inspired Keith, and then Keith in turn inspires us.
Yeah.
Ed played on that, but he played on a few other things as well. Nice to have him there. Next up, a good friend of the show, good friend of Keith, good friend of yours, C.J. Vanston. You told me a little bit off the record here that he came up with the title for this whole thing.
Yeah, the Fanfare for the Uncommon Man, because we had it as just the original, or the official Keith Emerson Tribute Concert, and then he said, "Oh man, you should call it that." And I said, "That's a perfect subtitle for it. We'll put that at the bottom." So he came up with that. He does this great thing. He does a beautiful piano dedication to Keith. With Michael Fitzpatrick, on cello, just this heartfelt ballad that he did for him, and then which was also actually accompanied by a second slideshow that Michael Prescott put together, and then then he, of course, the other things that he does too. It's just he's a phenomenal keyboard player, and he and I were the ones that went over when Keith had passed, and we had to go, and Mari had us go into Keith's room and go through all of his stuff, and try to log and box all that stuff. And that was an emotional experience for both of us. And it was glad that we were both there for each other, because it was tough, going in there and going through. But at the same time, it was amazing, because we were going through there and seeing all the music that he had written, second piano concerto, things like that, all of this gold stuff that, fans would have just gone nuts over. Yep. It was nice to share that, as a couple of fanboys in there as well, as well as just kind of, wrapping things up.
And, either photo montage, the one that starts it out, or the one you mentioned with CJ plays with the cellist, Michael Fitzpatrick, either or would have been enough. Having two of them is just like sort of an embarrassment of riches. And it's nice that CJ did that, and it's also nice he played on some of the other more, rollicking things as well, because he's such a talented guy.
Yes.
But, speaking of emotion, I mean, what really brings that out of anybody, another of the keyboard players was Keith's own son, Aaron. Mm-hmm. And, he does a nice solo piano piece just by himself, unaccompanied. And I mean, this had to be an extremely emotional night for him. I mean, this is his actual dad. So,
Yeah.
what kind of feedback did you get from Aaron about
Well,
this?
yeah, I mean, he wrote this, for the night, and it was, yeah, there wasn't a dry eye in the house too when he was doing it. You can imagine, and
Mm,
he wasn't, it was a beautiful ballad. He wasn't trying to be technically accomplished as far as like riffs and stuff because it wouldn't have been right for it. The mood. He just played this beautiful, eloquent piece that he wrote for his dad,
yeah,
and it was just the perfect foil because you hear, with throughout the entire night you have all of these different musical styles from country to classical to rock, all of these things coming at you a mile a minute. Very intense stuff, very dynamic stuff. And then you'd have these moments of these musical oases that were simple, like Kai's version of Prelude, and Aaron's version of this, and CJ's version of the tribute that he did to Keith. And it became these moments where it was like a palate clearer, where we could take a minute and really reflect on
mm,
those elements that Keith brought to us. And so that's what was great. It was a really well balanced
yeah.
show, and Aaron, was kind of like the centerpiece to that as far as really putting that across. So yeah, it was. I'm sure it was. I admire him for being up there and doing all of that because it couldn't have been easy.
Oh no, it had to be hard. I mean, under any circumstance, but particularly just being surrounded by the presence of his dad and then having to perform on top of that. But boy, he came through. He delivered.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
yeah, now that I think about it, I hadn't really articulated. But yeah, the show is extremely well paced in terms of mixing up, these, balancing and juggling all these different players and all these
yeah,
different styles of music, as you said.
yeah.
But we need to finish our list of players here. We got some more recognizable names coming up, but as with Mike Wallace, maybe one of the lesser household names, it would be Jonathan Sindelman.
Yeah. Jonathan is a amazing player in his own right. He was with Alan White. He's done a lot of things, and I knew that he was my kind of my rock in as much as he takes all the time and he scrutinizes parts and makes sure that everything is right on. An amazing work ethic. And I knew that if I had him up there for the majority of the time, if anybody went down in flames, it's always possible, somebody's gear goes out or whatever, I could always depend on Jonathan to shoulder the herd, and to pick up where somebody may have left off. He's great at that. But I wanted to give him a couple of areas, to shine.
Yeah.
One of them being Tank, where he does that whole clavinet thing, and ELP rarely did that live. They do a piece of it, but they never do the entire thing. At least I never saw him do the entire thing, or very rarely did they do it. But he really wanted to get that opening clavinet thing dialed, and the thing with that was it was Keith. Keith was overdubbing that. That was 2 tracks of that, and then Jonathan only had 1 shot at doing 4 hands. So we sat and scrutinized that and got that working, and he nailed it. He just completely nailed it. And then of course Joe Travers picks up where Jonathan leaves off. But yeah, Jonathan is an amazing talent.
Well, moving on, the French pianist Philippe Saisse, I think a lot of people know him. He's got some really nice moments in the show.
Mm-hmm.
Not surprised there. We're going to hear one of his contributions a little bit later. Now, does Philippe still live in France, or is he an LA
No,
guy?
he lives. He's actually we're good friends. Our sons went to art center together. That's where I actually met Philippe. I'd seen him with I saw him with Al Di Meola years ago. When he had the Gino Vanelli hair.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember going, man, that keyboard, he's amazing. And then he goes over and he plays vibes and he plays all these things. He's incredible. And I always wondered, what he did. And after that, it was just my ignorance, right? I didn't follow it. And our kids went to the same class together, and we ended up kind of talking with his wife. And then he came one day, and we all went out to a Mexican restaurant. And then he said what his first name was, Philippe. So I said, wait a minute, you keyboard player? And he goes, yeah, I know you, It's like, I saw you with Al Di Meola, and then we became really good friends, and our kids played together growing up, and all of that. So I wanted him part of this because he brings this jazz thing that, is just unparalleled. He's one of the great jazz pianists of all time. He did this beautiful jazz thing that Keith loved to do. over from the beginning. Just as we used to jazz out on that, it was great. And Philippe did this just beautiful solo over that, and just again, his touch. And he was one of those guys that doesn't look down at the keyboard very often. He looks up. He looks up at the players and he connects with them. And him and Greg were having a conversation all day. When it comes to that, you listen to Greg, and Greg, his ears are probably bigger than any drummers I ever seen. He'll pick up on anything and make that into a thing and comment on it, and then offer a question that somebody else will answer back musically. The exchange that goes on between those guys is incredible. CJ and Greg do it as well. Just those are my favorite parts of the show, where they're having a conversation without ever speaking a word, but playing a lot of sentences and paragraphs. And when you really listen to that, that's where the jazz improvisation really takes hold. And nobody does it like Philippe.
No, we were talking about the sort of, greatest hits that you expect, from the beginning. It's one of the highlights of the show, and it's an inspired choice having him sit in with that. It's definitely, as it was going on, I was thinking, wow, man, this is great. I mean, if this was the only thing on the CD, it would probably still be worth getting the CD just for that.
Well, and I knew Keith would love it, because, when Keith and I would do that, either as a trio or we do it, he loved going into that jazz area and doing that. He never did that enough, in his own music, where he really, really exploited that. He loved that. So, when we take the advantage to doing that, we'd go off for a while and let him kind of live in there for a while. And it was great. He was completely happy being there. So that's kind of why I chose Philippe for that. Yeah. Because I thought Keith would, of any of the keyboardists, all the great ones, I think Philippe would have made him smile the most by doing exactly what he did on this tune.
No, Keith would have said, "Hey man, are you Gino Vanelli?"
Yeah.
Well, as great as Philippe was, we're still not done here. I mean, we got a nice little mini set from one of Keith's contemporaries and one of his countrymen too, Brian Auger, who brought along his own rhythm section. We mentioned before his son played drums, and he brought his own bass player, so they're all used to each other. I mean, that was a nice treat. That was a nice moment. If only Brian Auger had stopped by, there again, that's a show right there, right?
Yeah, exactly.
He's just one part of it. And we're still going. Eddie Jobson, for crying out loud. He turned in the great playing you'd expect, given his reputation and his accomplishments, but he's up there on that huge, clunky Moog synthesizer, the one with all the chord patches. And is that Keith's own instrument?
Yeah. I mean, that was thanks to Brian Kehoe, and Gene Stopp, who were in charge of Keith's rig and all of that, getting that sound out of there, and so it's just, and then of course Eddie's very, very meticulous about making sure that it's exactly the same. He'd put it up on an oscilloscope. Okay, there's a little bit of a curve missing right here. That's just very, very meticulous, but it works, and then at that point, then he just, it enables him to get into it to the degree that he can really emote from there. And I think he channeled Keith beautifully, on it. And just, he was so proud of being able to play on that Moog, because you'd seen it from afar for so many years, and to be able to actually play on it, it's kind of like riding Peter Fonda's Easy Rider, Captain America bike, it's just one of those cool things.
No, definitely. And this is what I say. This is why you don't just want to hear the album. That's great enough, but you want to experience it visually. There's photos of Stevie Wonder and the Beatles in Abbey Road, and Keith, of course, fiddling with those things when it was a new instrument. Obviously, Bob Moog made it more accessible, and a lot of people sort of moved on. But Keith moved on, but also kept it around. He mentioned, I spoke with him, and his dad was a telephone operator. That was his dad's profession. I think he kind of felt like, yeah, I'm a musician, Dad, but look, I kind of do what you do.
I can plug these. I'll connect you with the chief oscillator.
And rounding out, let's just call him Player 11, because I think he is actually the last guy to come and perform, Jordan Rudess of Dream Theater. And he was one of those guys you mentioned, or we've sort of alluded to, who's like, okay, this is my life. Oh, that's Keith Emerson? Okay, now this is my... He even said on stage, Keith led him away from classical and into a different vein. And Keith's that type of player. I think it was similar for CJ and others. But, I mean, what a collection of keyboard players. I mean, you're not going to see that combination ever again at the same concert. And it was all about, respect for you too, Mark, but also about love for Keith.
We were all servants of the music. And I think that's what the bottom line is to all this. Because as a musician, you no musician is greater than the music that you perform. And when you start thinking that's when you got problems. Yeah. and they knew that this music, they were all, not only fans of, but they were servants to it.
Yeah.
And I think they all kind of went, what is our team role in getting this music realized to the crowd in the best way possible? That's, and let's discover that together and do it as a team.
Yeah.
And that's why it worked so well. There was no all-stars on this team, although it was full of all-stars.
Yeah.
They didn't act that way. And so that was the great part of it. And Jordan was certainly part of that team effort, because we kind of worked in his arrangement that he originally had of Tarkus with our arrangement. And we traded back and forth and said, let's use yours here. Let's use ours here. Let's use Keith's here. Let's see what we can come up with. And that's what we did for Tarkus.
Yeah, oh yeah, another highlight. And it's one thing to love the music. It's another thing to play the music. And, this is a funk that cannot be faked. So,
Right.
Hats off to all 11 of those people I mentioned who had to, get on Keith's own instrument and try. And, every single one of them, I would say, captured the spirit of Keith, but with their own sort of flavor. And, Jordan is a great example of that, because some of the sounds he chose, with the Moog being the authentic instrument, and that's great, but it's also kind of great to hear those parts played maybe a little bit differently in terms of, a different choice and everything.
Yeah.
So it's great.
And I thought Jordan did a beautiful job with that. He knew when to use the classic sounds and when to then expound on that and see if you can put a new band on that hat, and that's what he did.
Oh, definitely. And since we're talking about Tarkus, you mentioned giving the different players the opportunity to play what meant the most to them. I was wondering, as I was watching this, how it was decided who would do what, rock, paper, scissors, is there drawing straws? Because you made a joke during the show on stage, about a little bit of a conflict pertaining to the drums on Tarkus. More than one person wanted to play on it. What did Troy have to do to yank that one away from Joe?
Well, he did this in Munich, but we did it in parts. We didn't do the entire thing together. And so he had yet to play the thing front to back without stopping.
Oh, yeah.
And, so he called me. He said, because we were supposed to go to Japan with Keith, before, what happened. And, we had rehearsed it and all of that. And he was really looking forward to it. And then obviously that didn't happen. So he called me and said, look, man, I don't, I'm a pretty easygoing guy, but dude, I really want to play Tarkus. It means a lot to me because, I'm not used to this kind of stuff. I'm a pretty straight head drummer, and, and this stuff, it really opened me up and it gave me a new, a kind of a new thing to look at as far as things that I can do now that I didn't have the confidence to do before. So it's very meaningful for me. So I said, okay, let me call Joe, because I told him, that he was going to play it. So, and then Joe he was fine with it. I said, Joe, he was like, oh man, I can't play. He said, no, look, I'll tell you what though, let's do Tank, because that'll give you the only drum solo in the entire show, because nobody else does a drum solo. It's just, you'll do the Carl thing. And he was fine with that. He just said, that's cool. Because when he first met Keith, and this was a story that no one knows. When we did the Boys Club, it was a very funny moment for me. And that was when Keith first walked in. Joe had never met him, and this was at Center Staging. And Keith walked in to start rehearsals for the Boys Club. And Joe happened to be on the drums. And he screams across the hall, screams across the entire sound stage. He goes, Keith Emerson, I have only one thing to say to you. And he goes, just starts Tank.
Nice.
And Keith runs up and starts playing Tank, and before we knew it, we were just playing Tank, which was not in the set. We just ended up doing it. Yeah. But Joe was fine with the stuff that he did. That's what I'm saying. Everybody was like, no, whatever you want to do, it's all good. We're all doing the same thing together at the same, for whatever. So he was perfectly fine with it. He was a real gentleman.
It's funny because as I hear you tell that story, is Troy, I'll give you Tarkus, but Joe, I'll give you Tank in exchange. Is like coming to FX, Marc Bonilla, the negotiator. Well, it was pretty obvious over the course of the show, just by the eye lines, that everybody on stage was frequently looking to you for guidance, in terms of who should come in, how to end the tune.
Blame somebody if something went wrong. Yeah,
let's somebody to blame. No, but I mean, it's kind of like, in those moments, because like you said, one rehearsal, for crying out loud. Yeah. So, it was good you were there to keep it together and everybody could turn to you. But, we're due for some more music. And before we get there, just a couple little more name checks. We spoke about Philippe Sace playing that jazzy piano and from the beginning. A couple other standouts for me. Brian Auger's take on Fanfare for the Common Man, I liked it because it's almost like he sort of hinted at it more than actually playing it full out.
Yeah.
There was enough of it in there that you're like, oh, that's kind of it. And I also like how he mashed it up with a Brubeck medley because, Keith and Dave Brubeck were actually friends and mutual admirers. So there's an extra layer to that. But also, one of the things CJ did, the one that Travis sang on, there was a three-piece at that point. It was just, bass, keyboards, drums. And I just found it for that moment, for that one tune, aesthetically pleasing, just sort of harken back to that trio instrumentation.
Yeah, that's why I chose not to be there. It was like, you don't need me here. The one thing that this doesn't need, it's guitar. Yeah. And so I bowed out because it obviously didn't need it.
Yeah, and that makes sense musically, but also visually. I go, yeah, ELP was such like Rush, such a trio format. Speaking of ELP, when I spoke with Keith, we touched on the subject of Nut Rocker, and he explained how that was really intended to be sort of a musical joke by the band because they saw something like their interpretation of Pictures of an Exhibition as being, the right way to adapt classical music into a rock form. And then this Bee Bumble and the Stingers, Nut Rocker thing, they thought, well, that's kind of a cheesy way to do it. So they kind of did it sort of as a joke, and he said, well, let's let the audience sort out what's what. But now I happen to know that you've mentioned Boys Club a couple of times. Over the years, with projects like that, you guys have further developed that into a more significant, high energy opus.
That started with the Marc and Brian Christmas show. First of all, I do want to say, when we did the Emerson benefit in Birmingham, Rick Wakeman and I were talking about Nut Rocker, and he said, "Oh yeah, Nut Rocker." He says, "Keith stole that." He says, "I wanted to do that, and he trumped me. He went in there and did it before we could do it, So he said, he just said he beat me to the punch on that. And I said, well, look, there's another one that Bee Bumble and the Stingers did. It was, what was it? It was Flight of the Bumblebee.
Yeah.
So at some point we kind of made a pact that we're going to do that together and release it.
Sweet.
I said, and if we do that, I'm playing your guitar for you. And he goes, yep, you sure will. So, but when it came to Nut Rocker, it was taken from Tchaikovsky's The March from Nutcracker Suite. And when the Marc and Brian show was in full swing, we do these Christmas shows every year, and I was the musical director for those. And I got I think the first time we did this, I think Kevin Gilbert was on stage with us. So we do it every year because people just loved it.
Yeah.
But what we did is I decided to put a little more Tchaikovsky in there. So we open with the Sugar Plum Fairy in kind of full Spinal Tap glory, ba ba boom bum bum bum. Then we get into Nut Rocker proper, and then at the end we do the Russian dance, the dun 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 dun. That thing. We do the tree pack for that, and Keith loved it. We used to do it as the encore, the final thing of the night. We'd always do it, and people would just be going nuts, and it was a good arrangement. It was a fun arrangement. I would put little things in there to shake it up, different tempo changes and different chordal little things that just come in and out at a moment's notice, just to keep things fresh and exciting, and Keith loved playing it, so we decided we should do it,
And one reason I'm spotlighting this one is because I think a lot of Keith fans and ELP fans might not have heard this expanded version you're speaking about, so they'll probably enjoy it. And also it's another chance to spotlight some of these many musicians we spoke about. We've got Philippe Sace again. Now he's playing the acoustic piano, but also Jonathan Sindelman is playing keyboards. So we got two keyboard players going. Joe Travers on drums, Mick Mahan on bass, and then you and Mike Wallace flipping back and forth with the guitars and playing some harmony stuff. Pretty cool.
Yeah.
So from Fanfare for the Uncommon Man, the Keith Emerson Tribute Concert, let's check out some Tchaikovsky meets ELP.
And the one and the two and the
Lawrence Welk. You know it. You love it. Get ready to get crushed by a dwarf. It's the Nut Rocker.